So hello to you wherever you are around the globe. Welcome to our second episode in our 2020 ACEs conversation. And tonight we explore ACEs and poverty. We have two very special guests joining us tonight, and we're deeply honoured to have, first of all, Professor Sir Michael Marmot from UCL, University College London, Institute of Health Equity. And joining us from New York today, Benjamin Perks from UNICEF New York, and also the University of Birmingham. So, Michael, if I could come to you first of all, hello and good evening. How are you? How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I won't bore you by telling you what I've been doing today, but it's linked to this evening.
Wait, it sounds intriguing. You're joining us from North London. How have you been coping with these new times that we find ourselves in, Sir Michael?
Well, it's a mixed picture. I tell myself every single day how privileged I am to be locked down in a comfortable house with access to green space, not far away. And then I spend every day working on inequalities, which means that most of the world doesn't share these privileges. People are going out into frontline occupations, being exposed or losing their jobs or living in overcrowded accommodation, no access to green space. So it's a mixed picture. I'm incredibly privileged to be able to work from home in comfortable surroundings. And most of the world is not like that.
Benjamin, if I could come to you now, Benjamin, you're in New York, and how's life over the pond? How are you finding things?
Good evening, good afternoon from New York. I think I'm with Sir Michael. I think that I am getting through the pandemic situation, patently aware of the level of inequality all around me, the courage of the frontline workers, the struggle of people that are living in poverty, the struggle of children, 300,000 children in New York City who don't have connection to the internet, cannot do online schooling. I think it's a difficult time for everybody, but it's also a time when we can be aware of what we have, aware of the importance of relationships, and reimagine a better tomorrow when we get through the pandemic.
That's interesting, Benjamin. If I could call you Ben, if that's okay. It's interesting when you talk about one of the richest cities in the world. I imagine New York, as it would be with London. Are there major inequalities there in terms of the very wealthy and the very poor?
Yes, I think it's also something Sir Michael has written about and talked about a lot. The level of inequality. We just look at health outcomes. We have the wealthiest health system in the world, but America would rank 62 in a league table of countries in terms of life expectancy, in terms of child mortality and other things. We see really, in many ways, a tale of two cities here in New York and across the United States.
Well, Ben, it's an absolute honor to have you, and I'll come back to you in just a second, if I may. So, Michael, if we could start the conversation, if anybody Googles you, they will find pages and pages and pages of your achievements. But if you could give us a wee bit of background, if you like, a little bit of background as to what you're currently doing with your work and the impact it's having, and then we can talk about the report that was released in 2010 and so on, and what the findings are these days. But what are you currently doing? What are you focusing on in terms of your work in the here and now, Sir Michael?
Well, just relate to the way you said it. I spent my life as a researcher doing research, and if at the end of writing a paper, like all researchers, you say more research is needed, and if anybody said, so what? You'd say, so I'll write another paper. And that's what I did. And then more or less one day, I asked, what if somebody took the research seriously? And then I thought, maybe I should take the research seriously. And so for the last 15 years, I've been very much involved in packaging the research to influence policy. I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We reported in 2008, and we said Equity from the start. Give every child the best start in life. That was our #1 recommendation in the WHO Commission report. And then I was invited by, you know, that Scotsman, Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister, you remember him, to answer the question, how could we apply the findings and recommendations of your global report to one country, England? And in 2010, published the Marmot Review. And then in February this year, it feels like another era before the pandemic crashed upon us, I published Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on, and looking at what had happened over the last decade. And when I said, I won't bore you, maybe I will bore you, what I'm doing right at the moment, we will publish on the 15th of December, the Marmot Review COVID-19. In other words, relooking at our February 2020 report in the light of what has happened, not just with COVID, but with lockdown, with the societal response, as how that impacts on inequalities. So in a way, it updates the 2020 report, and we're going to call this December report Build Back Fairer. Not just better, but build back fairer. And we'd like to think that the recommendations we'll make, which build on the 2020 report, will provide the basis for what we need to do as a society to build back fairer.
And Sir Michael, will the highest levels of government be looking at that report?
The highest levels of the shadow government will be looking at the report. Whether the actual existing government looks at the report, well, I hope so. That should be their responsibility. When we produced the report in February, we published it on a Tuesday. Prime Minister's question was on a Wednesday, and an MP from Gateshead in the north of England asked the Prime Minister what he was going to do about Marmot's new report. And he said a lot of nice words about Marmot, but very few words about what he was going to do in relation to our report. So we know they know about it. Let's see.
So Michael, we'll come back to that in just a moment or two, if we may. Ben, if I can come back to you in New York, could you just give us an overview? I mean, once again, you know, if somebody Googles you, your list of achievements are equally as impressive. But what's your work currently with UNICEF?
I have to humbly say they are nowhere near equally as impressive as Professor Sir Michael Marmot's amazing accomplishments. My role in UNICEF is advocacy. I work on trying to build the political will and the public demand for policies that will improve the situation of children in terms of poverty, in terms of ACEs, in terms of health, well-being outcomes, and a variety of different policy issues.
I think it's equally exciting that you're here this evening, because you have a truly international view with your role in UNICEF. So I'd like to come and talk about that as the hour goes on. But I want to start at the top with the question that we're very keen to explore, is about poverty and ACEs. Ben, how do you see them intersecting? Indeed, if that's the right word.
Well, my view is there are three things that happen in childhood that are so profound, they can have lasting impacts. They can be a massive risk factor for inequality and poor life outcomes in almost every area of well-being, health, learning, social, and so on. And they are poverty. That's the first one. The second one is exclusion because of race or gender or disability. And the third one is adverse childhood experiences. Sometimes these three things converge and sometimes they don't. To give a very simple example, I think two of the cultural highlights of November have been Shuggie Bain winning the Booker Prize, a story from Glasgow, and The Crown, the TV series The Crown. In Shuggie Bain, we learn about poverty and adverse childhood experiences, but The Crown, which is about wealth and privilege, also has a story of adverse childhood experiences and how that affects very wealthy, privileged adults throughout the entire life cycle. So I think we need to look at the three things as often being interconnected, but also sometimes existing in isolation. I think that's really important, in isolation from each other.
And Sir Michael, we would like to get your view on this at this moment in time. Poverty and ACEs, a connection, intersecting. What's your view on that?
Everything I look at in relation to health and well-being follows a social gradient. And by that, I mean, if you classify individuals by income, education, occupational status, or because we have the data and it's convenient, by the level of deprivation of the area in which they live, you find a social gradient. It's true for life expectancy, it's true for measures of ill health, and it's true for measures of early child development. The more deprived the area, the smaller the proportion of children age 5 with a good level of development. So there's less of the good stuff going on as you get down the hierarchy. And if you look at ACEs, we looked at 9 different types of adverse child experiences, and almost all of them follow neatly the social gradient. The more deprived, the higher the frequency, whether it's physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, parental separation, mental illness in the parents, alcohol and drug use in the parents, and so on. Nearly all follow the social gradient. So it's not just that poverty is bad in terms of increased risk of adverse child experiences, but the more deprived the area, the higher the frequency of ACEs and the lower the frequency of good child development.
Your review back in 2010, and obviously you're reviewing it now, and then there's the COVID report, as you mentioned, coming up later this year. What were the results in 2010, and what were the differences when you've reviewed them 10 years later on in 2020?
So the results in 2010, pretty much as I've just described. We looked at research that showed, let's take the good side first, that the higher the social position, the less deprived, the more likely were parents to play with their children, talk to their children, read to their children, cuddle their children. It showed us cuddling their children. At the bottom of the social gradient, if you look by income in the bottom quintile, bottom 20%, about 20% of parents of children aged 3 denied that it was important to cuddle a child. About 20% of children in the most deprived quintile denied that it was important to talk to a child aged 3. Now, it's been put to me, oh, you're blaming poor parents for being bad parents. This is tricky territory. No, I'm not. I'm blaming the situation that parents find themselves in. And I very much thought at the time, if somebody like me, well-meaning, goes to a single mother who's worried about whether she can pay the rent at all and says, you should read bedtime stories to your children, the mother might say, I would, if I was sure I would have a bed, let alone a book. We know that according to Shelter, about 1/3 of families are one paycheck away from homelessness. So it's not that parents are bad parents, but if they're in difficult situations, it's very difficult to do those good parenting things. And it's more likely, as I said a few moments ago, that adverse child experiences will be present for all the reasons I said. So we found both of those. And one of the striking things in the 10 years is that child poverty went up. between 2010 and 2019. If you look at child poverty defined as less than 60% median income, nationally in England, in 2009-10, about 18% of children were in poverty before housing costs were taken into account, 27% after housing costs. So housing is a significant contributor to poverty. And that 27% became 30% 10 years later, 30% of kids in poverty. If you look at a single parent household headed by a single parent not in work, the proportion of kids in poverty went up from 62% to 70%. Work was supposed to be the way out of poverty. If you look at a single parent in full-time work, the level of child poverty went up from 18% to 30%. So this was striking. Now, one of the things that the big innovations that the previous government, the Labour government, was proud of, and I hasten to add, I'm not speaking in a party political way. I'm just telling you what happened. And one of the things that the previous government did was establish Sure Start children's centres. Between 2010 and 2019, 1,000 Sure Start children's centres closed. So these centres that were available to try and deal with breaking the link between deprivation and adverse childhood experiences and deprivation and lack of good parenting, those centres whose mission was to break that link, 1,000 of them closed because of the cuts in funding to local government. So the picture between 2010 and 2019-20 was very much an adverse one.
Were the what impact do you think, Sir Michael, were the years of austerity, or you know, the years of austerity that we've all lived through? How much of an impact has that had on the latest results, do you think?
I'm a cautious scientist. Correlation is not causation, so I hate to jump to conclusions. We don't have a controlled experiment, but what we can say is the government that was elected in 2010 after the global financial crisis had as a mission rolling back the state. And in 2019, 42% of GDP went in public expenditure. We were in the middle of the European range. And between 2009-10, 42%, that went down every year. So by 2019, that 42% had become 35% public expenditure. We were towards the bottom of the European range. So they did roll back the state. Now, forgive me for citing numbers, but I live with these numbers all the time. Try and keep these in your head. If you look at the spending by local government, by level of deprivation, so for the least deprived 20%, the local government spending per person went down by 16% over the decade. And then the more deprived the area, the greater the reduction. So in the most deprived quintile, it went down by 32%. The greater the need, the greater the reduction. It was exactly the opposite to what we were discussing before we started proportionate universalism, spending proportionate to need. This was spending inversely proportionate to need. Well, how could that not have an effect? So yes, I think it's highly likely that austerity and administering austerity in a highly regressive way was damaging to the health and well-being of the population and was likely to play a causal role in the increase in health inequalities.
Ben, if I could come to you in New York, you have a global view on poverty. and the description that Sir Michael has just given us, where do we fare really as far as the UK is concerned if you compare us to the rest of the world? Are we comparative with other countries? Are we worse? Are we in the middle? Whereabouts are we, Ben, in terms of our performance?
I am primarily somebody that works on low and middle income countries, so I don't spend an enormous amount of time seeing where the UK fits into all of that. I do want to give a bit of a global picture on what Sir Michael Marmot just said, and then maybe come back to your question. I think that COVID-19 has illustrated some of these problems in a very clear way. Approximately 150 million children in the world have entered into child poverty as a result of the COVID-19 measures. That's a 15% increase into global child poverty prior to the pandemic. We have an enormous amount of expenditure globally on mitigating the consequences of COVID-19, but a fraction of it goes on children. And I think that when Sir Michael talked about austerity over the past decade, we've also seen austerity. We've also seen a stagnation globally on previous decades of progress. If you look at indicators like literacy, poverty, hunger, and childhood disease, we had been making progress until a couple of decades ago, and now we have stagnated. And this creates enormous risk and vulnerability across the world. I think that another critical point is the rising inequality. Inequality has grown in the United States, a country that was founded on the idea of social mobility, or was developed very much with the idea of social mobility at its core, with the Statue of Liberty, and you know the idea that you can come with nothing, and because this has the opportunities for social mobility have dramatically reduced here and in many other countries, and we see in particular that mismanaged deindustrialization in many high-income countries has created a new kind of poverty in declining towns, which has affected not only people's income and access to services, but also their sense of identity and belonging. And that creates even more tension in the community. We see that in the UK, we see that in the US, we see that in countries all over the world. The challenge of the issue is that this is not just a human rights issue. It's not just a social justice issue. Here in the United States, it's estimated that 4% of GDP is lost because of child poverty. You know, tackling child poverty increases well-being and wealth for entire populations.
Gosh, it's when we look at figures like that and numbers, and we think about the effect that COVID's had, it's not a pretty picture. Is there a way out of this, do you think, Ben?
Yes, I think there is. I think that we have to invest in addressing child poverty by expanding and modernizing opportunities, by addressing strengthening social welfare systems, by investing in early childhood, in doing many of the measures Sir Michael has highlighted, and also by building these reforms in proportion to need. We would like every child to go to preschool between 3 and 6. Not going to preschool is a major driver of intergenerational poverty. But we should start by enrolling the children who are in the bottom quintile, the poorest children first. We need to have universal support for parenting, but we need to target those who need it most the first. And we need to have progressive rather than regressive expenditures on education systems that are failing around the world. Often less is being spent than those that are doing well. So we need to have, what we need to do from an advocacy perspective is to remind people of previous decades of progress on childhood disease, on poverty, and all of that, and to remind people that investing in children is essential for the well-being of society, for the prevention of crime, for productivity, for performance. It's also the right thing to do from a social justice and human rights perspective. But even if people don't believe in those things, from the perspective of economic growth and development, it's also important.
Do you think there'll be a change in direction in America with the upcoming change of administration?
I'm a United Nations official. I cannot give a comment on an individual member state and its the politics of an individual member state. I apologize for that. What I would say is that when we've had global catastrophes such as the Second World War and previous major international catastrophes that are protracted over a period of time, often what has followed is a period of progressive investment in social development. And we would hope for that, and we would encourage governments all around the world to ensure that they are investing in their own social welfare systems, their own efforts to address poverty, ACEs and exclusion, but also that the high-income countries are contributing to helping middle and low-income countries to address those things as well.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Can I come in there?
Certainly.
I'm not a UN official. As I said, I'm not party political. I'm not related to government or political parties. That chap who just lost the election in the US, I've forgotten his name already, yesterday's man. But before he was president, I was giving a lecture in the US, which I used to do a lot pre-COVID, and I was trying to make the point that there were two types of action to deal with early child development and ACEs. One was to reduce poverty, and the other was to break the link between poverty and poor early child development and ACEs. And I thought if I compared the US with Sweden, my American audience would say, Sweden, you know, that's a Marxist, Leninist hellhole, you know, how could we? So I thought I'd compare it with Australia. You know, I thought Americans think Australia sounds a bit like Texas, just a bit further to the west. And so if you compare child poverty, the figures I had then, they will have changed a bit, were the ones I was quoting earlier were less than 60% median income. These figures were less than 50% median income. And so they've changed a bit. But before taxes and benefits, child poverty in Australia was about 25%, and the US was about 23%. After redistribution, after taxes and benefits, child poverty in Australia went down from 25% to about 12%. And in the US went down from 23% to 22.5%. And I looked at the audience. It was a big audience from the American Public Health Association. Remember, Obama was the president. And I said, you live in a democracy. This must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you'd elect a government that did something different. And then they elected a president. And to me, the pornography of the president wasn't what he did with a porn star, but they did nothing about child poverty. So going back to what they had I've forgotten his name, the president who's just left, is not ideal. Is not ideal by any means. If what President Biden does is simply reestablish the status quo pre-Trump, that's far from ideal. That's huge inequalities, high levels of child poverty, real problems, quite apart from the rise of so-called deaths of despair of drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Because if the parents are killing themselves with drugs, alcohol, and suicide, can you imagine the effect on the children of parents who are in despair? So, and that was all happening pre-Trump. So we need to be very careful as we think about building back better post-COVID. We do not want to go back to the status quo. The status quo in the US and the UK was far from ideal. And it's such a relief to have the idea, a president who might tell the truth, who might have good values. I mean, it's a real relief for the whole world. I'm not a UN official. To have somebody who seems like a decent person and surrounds himself with people who look like decent people, who with good values, it's such a relief. But simply to reestablish the status quo ante is not acceptable.
With building better, Sir Michael, and I know that the report hasn't been released yet, so you may not want to go there, but I'll ask the question if I may. Is ACEs referenced in the recommendations going forward?
Well, we're certainly concerned about early childhood, and we had recommendations in the 2020 report, the one we did in February, about reducing child poverty, re-establishing services for parents and young children. And we had the example, I've been giving you a lot of bad news. Let me give you some good news. In our 2020 report, we looked at what was going on in Manchester. What you see, and it was an English report. I know we're talking in Scotland, so forgive me, but it was a report about England. But the figures in Scotland are very similar. And what you see is that children eligible for free school meals, they're the poorer children, do worse on scores of early child development. So it's a poverty measure, free school meals. And in Greater Manchester, not only do the poor kids, the ones eligible for free school meals, do worse than the average, they do worse than free school meals children in other parts of the country. So Manchester looked pretty awful. If you're going to be poor, don't be poor in Greater Manchester, because the kids do even worse. And in 3 years, Greater Manchester closed that gap between the poor children in Manchester and the poor children in the rest of the country. And you ask them, what did you do? Well, we focused on it. As Ben tells us, there's good evidence you can make a difference. There's good, substantive, scientific evidence that you can make a difference. And they applied that evidence in Manchester, and they closed the gap between the poor kids in Manchester and the poor kids in the rest of the country. There's still a gap between poor kids in Manchester and the average, so they've got a way to go yet. But that's encouraging that you can make a difference in only 3 years.
That difference in Greater Manchester, was that because of political will, or was that because of people pressure?
Well, Greater Manchester is an exciting place at the moment. We're working with them. I take no credit for the closing the gap, because we started working with them after they closed the gap. So that wasn't anything we did, but we're working with Greater Manchester. And the mayor of Greater Manchester is providing political leadership, but they very much believe in engaging the population to the extent possible. They don't want this to be just the mayor. They're involving, there are 10 cities in Greater Manchester. They're involving the cities. And indeed, the cities are trying to involve the different sectors, including the third sector, the non-governmental sector, civil society. So it's always difficult to know what it means to involve the population, because civil society organizations aren't necessarily representative, but still they're non-governmental, and it's very important to involve them. So yes, they are trying to be inclusive.
I asked the question because in Scotland, Sir Michael, it's been the grassroots movements of the ACE Aware Nation that's driven this conversation in Scotland in particular. So that's why I was asking the question about, if there were almost grassroots movements in Greater Manchester that were causing this change. I know that the political will needs to be there. And I think the second part of the question is it a model that can be replicated?
Well, it's a good question. We started working with Coventry. After my 2010 report, the English city of Coventry declared itself a Marmot city. So that was nice. But then the question was, did what they did make any difference? Because before you want to replicate it, you want to know if it's making a difference. Well, they had indicators that it was making a difference, improving the proportion of children age 5 with a good level of development, reducing the number of young people not in employment, education, or training, NEET, increasing the proportion of people who were getting a living wage. Wow, that's not bad. You could do those things at city level. And so Greater Manchester, when I went to see the mayor, I said, Coventry's doing it. Wouldn't it be terrific if Greater Manchester did it? That would be really good. So, and they had as a mission to try and reform public services in Greater Manchester. So in a way, they're trying to scale up what Coventry was doing in the context of already dealing with devolution and taking much greater control of health and care services and other services. So yeah, the hope is in England, Greater Manchester, Cheshire and Merseyside, Gateshead, a number of communities around the country are trying to do this, and that will get an evidence base that will answer your question of whether it's something that can be applicable elsewhere. And certainly, I hope it will be.
Ben, if I could come back to you in New York, and thank you for your patience. This is it's a fascinating conversation with the two of you. Ben, you were in Scotland in 2019 for the ACES conference here in Scotland in Glasgow, when our guest speaker was Gabor Mate. What did you take away from the conference? What were your impressions?
If you remember, Gary, I actually brought a delegation of government ministers from North Macedonia, and I wanted to really show them the way that when you open up a conversation about adverse childhood experiences in a non-judgmental, inclusive way, where we look at adverse childhood experiences kind of like the way we look at smoking, right? So we've all been affected by it. Most people have experienced adverse childhood experiences. Most people, if they haven't experienced them themselves, they're married to somebody or they live next door to somebody who has. They're a universal issue that affects most of us or all of us in some way. But now we know the consequences. We're working together at a policy level to bring them to an end. And this is what I've taken with me when I've worked in other countries, when I've spoken to parliaments and to communities about adverse childhood experiences. If you present it in a non-judgmental, inclusive way, people really identify with it. But in most countries around the world, there has not yet been a conversation about issues like neglect, child abuse, dysfunctional parenting. These are things that are not yet talked about in public. They remain taboo. So I think you're the beginning of what is becoming a kind of a global movement that's spreading and is becoming more influential in different parts of the world. I think that the challenge is that people who are progressive or who are politically active often are used to talking about poverty or exclusion. Sometimes can see a new set of ideas as kind of a threat to that, or as if it's trying to detract from those other issues. And I think we need to be clear that that's not what's happening here. Adverse childhood experiences are a different issue that we've only began to learn about as a policy issue in recent decades, but they are as urgent and as important and complementary to addressing poverty and social exclusion.
The guests that you brought over in 2019, what were their impressions? Did they take anything positive away that they've been able to implement?
Yeah, a lot. They mainstreamed ACEs into into the health system. They increased home visits, began to expand home visits, working towards universal home visits to support nurturing caregiving and early childhood development. It contributed to a decision to expand preschool, because we know one of the impacts of early adversity is the impact on child development and brain development and language acquisition, but this can be partially addressed by trauma-informed preschool. They also looked at education and making schools more trauma-informed, and so they took a lot from it. They looked at it from a holistic perspective, which I think is the way that you're talking about it in Scotland, and they took that back with them to North Macedonia. And we see in other countries similar efforts are going on. The Republic of Serbia, next door to North Macedonia, decided to do an ACE study. You see, I think in 30 countries around the world now, there have been ACE studies across continents. So I think it's part of an increasing recognition of the importance of this issue.
Certainly, in subsequent interviews that we've done and features around this, education, certainly in Scotland, plays a massive part in this movement, and being trauma informed in primary schools and secondary schools and also in preschool. In your professional view, Ben, how important is the schooling system, how the education system, how important is education to delivering what we need to do? I mean, we're talking about tackling poverty. How does education come into that, do you think?
Well, Sir Michael in Health Gap has written a chapter about resilient communities. I think the language, we have to work on the language of trauma informed. Is that the language we want to use? Are we talking about resilience? But it's a recognition that kids who are traumatized at home because of adverse childhood experiences, one of the most effective ways we think that they are addressed is by having relationships, positive relationships and experiences within the extended family, within the community, and within the school. So I think that if you can make that, a policy, if you can say the city of Glasgow or a county has a policy goal that it wants to make sure there is no child within that community who doesn't have a positive adult relationship. I think when we begin to think like that, I think we will begin to work towards the end, or trying to end, the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. These to me are the two of the most important interventions. The one is prevention of adverse childhood experiences by supporting the parent or the caregiver through poverty reduction and through parenting support, and then making sure that schools and communities build resilience, connections, and healthy relationships for kids.
So, Michael, 150 years ago, Charles Dickens was writing about poverty. Oliver Twist, we know the book From Childhood and so on. And here we are this year, not in Scotland, but certainly in England. There was the debate over feeding school children during holiday time. What were your views on that?
If you ask, what is the responsibility of a society? Well, making sure everybody has a meal might be pretty basic, really. And to say, well, it's family's responsibility. Well, yes, of course, it's family's responsibility. But let me quote you a figure that we had in my 2020 report. If families followed the healthy eating advice in England, families in the bottom 10% of household income would have to spend 74% of their income on food. I've already said earlier in this conversation that child poverty goes up dramatically when you take housing costs into account. The proportion of families that are spending more than a third of their income on housing has gone up dramatically. So we've got housing, poverty, and diet, this unholy triad. If housing's too expensive, then that increases poverty. If poverty's too bad, then you can't afford housing, and food misses out. You can heat or you can eat. And then children eligible for free school meals, many of them have parents who are working. We know in England, and we've tracked this over time, the majority of parents, the majority of people who are below the minimum income threshold in poverty have at least one adult in the household working. These are working households. They are in poverty, not because they're feckless or irresponsible or lazy or any other bad word you can think of. They're in poverty because they're lowly paid and they can't afford to feed their children. Not because they're lazy, but because they're poorly paid. So free school meals is a way of dealing with that. Then you close the schools. What happens to free school meals? Well, okay, you can do something. But then what about holidays? The fact that it took a 23-year-old footballer to bring this to the politicians' attention, well, fantastic. But he did it. Wow, fantastic. And he got the government to do a U-turn. And then he continued his campaign. What about over the holidays? No, absolutely not. They said this would be irresponsible for the government to give free school meal vouchers to poor kids over the holidays. That would breed unholy dependency. Hang on, you politicians are saying that. Have you not noticed we're going to get an 8% decline in GDP this year? Have you not noticed we've got a pandemic-induced recession? This isn't breeding dependency. This is making sure children don't go to bed hungry. And then he said, Marcus Rashford, our 23-year-old footballer, said, you know, I grew up without books. It'd be quite a good idea if kids could read. And forgive this, but can I read a tweet that somebody sent? He said, I'm so full of admiration for Marcus Rashford, persuading government to feed hungry children, and now running a book club to promote reading. And then quoted from my report, give every child the best start in life. All we need now is for Michael Marmot to score for Man United, and the circle is complete. So I think Marcus Rashford did a better job in my domain that I would do in his. He scores for Man United and helps feed hungry children. So, and all of the things we've been talking about are all made worse if children are hungry. And think about the parents. Can you imagine anything more stressful as a parent than not being able to feed your children? Now, we talk about stress in parents leading to adverse child experiences, but if you can't feed your children, you're in real stress. And will you indulge me for 2 minutes?
Absolutely.
If I move away from the United Kingdom, in Australia always ranks number 2 or number 3 on the Human Development Index. Human Development Index combines life expectancy, literacy, and gross national income per person, adjusting for purchasing power. If Indigenous Australians were classified as a separate country, they would rank 115 on the Human Development Index. So you've got the best country in the world, number 2 after Norway or Canada or whatever, and a subgroup of their population are in the low human development category. Now, I talk about proportionate policies that are universalist, but here you've got a subgroup that by any measure is in poverty. And I was taken on a visit to Sydney, I was taken to a shed. It was called The Shed in Western Sydney, set up by the Indigenous community, trying to prevent suicide in Aboriginal men. And Aboriginal men, so talking to people at this shed, so it's a tale of drugs, alcohol, domestic violence, children taken away from the parents, parental splitting, and the men get depressed and suicidal. And the rate of suicide in Aboriginal men is very high. And then talking to a lawyer there, it turned out, as she put it to me, that the default position of the child care services in Australia is not whether to take Aboriginal children into care, but when. The default position is that Aboriginal families are incompetent, we will take the children into care. And the next night, so that was in Sydney, I was in Melbourne, and I said to the people who'd invited me, I wanted to engage with the Indigenous community and because of the relatively poor health of Indigenous Australians. And I had dinner with leaders of something called VACHO, the Victorian Association of Community-Controlled Healthcare Organisations. So you asked earlier, Gary, about the community in Manchester. Well, these are community-controlled healthcare organisations, and the 10 people around the table were all Aboriginal, leading these community-controlled healthcare organisations. And I was a bit embarrassed that I had to give the dinner talk, because I thought, what do I know? You know, these people are experts. They live these lives. They know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. So I said to them, my understanding is it costs about $100,000 a year to take a child into care. Now, nobody, and I'm sure none of you, thinks that leaving a child with an abusive family with drugs and alcohol problems is good for that child. But none of us thinks it's good for the child to be taken into care either. It's a disaster. For $100,000 a year, couldn't you work with the families and do something about the drug and alcohol problems? And one woman from a rural town in Victoria said, we're doing it. And she mentioned some regulation. We've taken the formal responsibility for these children. So we're responsible for their well-being. And we use the money to work with the families. So it's exactly what Ben is talking about. We would like to reduce poverty, but that isn't happening. But the second part is there's a community-controlled organization that's working with the families to try and support the families, keep them together, reduce the drug and alcohol problems and the abuse problems, and keep the children with the families. Does it work? I don't know. I haven't seen the evidence, but by golly, it's inspiring that they're trying to do it.
Ben, coming back on that, is there any evidence in your work, with and through UNICEF that actually empowering communities around the world has much more of an impact? The type of work that that Sir Michael's been talking about. Is there any evidence that giving power to communities, it works? Is it a way forward?
There's growing evidence that it is the best delivery system for reaching particularly hard to reach communities. I think firstly because of trust. Secondly, because the community knows what's going on. And thirdly, because they have knowledge of the problems and the connections and the resources and the things that you need to do to build resilience in that community. So there is growing evidence that this works. For example, at the moment, we're doing a global advocacy call to treat parenting support a bit like the way we used to treat vaccines, that every child should, every newborn parent should have access to parenting support. But in some countries, the health system cannot do that. So we look at maybe religious organizations, civil society organizations, community-based, or extended informal traditional networks to do it. But yeah, I think it makes sense. It's about looking at the assets and the knowledge of those who are affected by exclusion and poverty and also adversity, and harnessing that knowledge as a superpower to drive forward better outcomes for children.
And you know, the hour has gone, as it always done, it's gone very, very quickly. We have about 4 minutes left, and we've talked about many things. I'd like to end on a note of optimism, Ben and Sir Michael. We're in really tough times when we're talking about poverty and children and the world in general. Is there a glimmer of hope of where we are now in terms of, you know, maybe what 2021 looks like, going to 2022? You know, is there a glimmer of optimism somewhere in all this?
So Michael first.
Oh, right, okay. So Michael.
Well, let me talk from my point of view. I've been trying to get people to think about social determinants of health, that health is not just the health care system, but it's the action of social determinants through the life course. And this evening, we've been talking rightly about early childhood, but through the life course. And do I have reason for hope? By golly, do I have reason for hope? It's all over the place. The genie is out of the bottle. People are talking about social determinants of health everywhere. The American Medical Association is talking about social determinants of health. Somebody writes a piece in the British Medical Journal yesterday saying that doctors aren't paying enough attention to social determinants of health. It's all over the place. If I showed you my diary, people are talking this language all over the place, so that there's a recognition that the health and well-being of the whole population through the life course, but early childhood is crucial for all the reasons we've been saying this evening, but a recognition that that's hugely influenced by what happens in society. So there's overwhelming evidence that people are taking it seriously. If you then ask, are governments listening? Well, yeah, Greater Manchester, Wales, the government in Wales. So if the national government doesn't listen, so in the United States, you know, I was critical. I said that before the president who's just departed, when Obama was president, there seemed to be very little happening at federal level. But cities all across the US were working on social determinants of health. So there's every reason to be hopeful that it doesn't necessarily happen at national level. Sometimes it does, but it can happen at civil society level, community level, at city and regional level, and at the level of practitioners. So there's no going back. People have understood the importance of this.
I just want to reiterate that. I think go and look, Gary, Susan, Pauline, go and look in the mirror. You are the hope. You have built a movement. You have taken the genie out of the bottle in Scotland. Scotland will never be the same. I think these things will continue to grow there and inspire the rest of us around the world. And if we come together and we work together and we try to build a sense of belonging without the political agitation and all of that, but we try to find commonality across constituencies and take these ideas forward, we will be able to work towards bringing an end to adversity, poverty and exclusion in the lives of children. This is something that we need to continue to work hard for, but I do have a lot of hope.
What a wonderful way to end, gentlemen. So Michael, Ben, it's been a really insightful hour. You've been very generous with your time. Can I thank you both very much indeed for your contributions this evening. We will be back on the 16th of December, and we will be focusing on ACES screening with Warren Larkin and Rena Romano. So please register for that and keep joining in the conversation. Thank you for joining us this evening, or indeed wherever you are in the world, whatever day part it is. Thank you once again. Thank you for all your wonderful comments, and you'll be able to see this video the recording of this video in the next few days. So please make sure you see it again and share it around the world. From me, Gary Robinson, thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.